The city woke slowly beneath a pale sky. The fog rolled between the towers like quiet ghosts. Lights flickered on, one by one, as the world yawned awake. And high above it all stood Edward Grant. He sipped his coffee, watching the streets come alive below. To him, the silence wasn't peace, it was power. He whispered to his reflection, "You built this, Edward. Don't ever forget it." His voice carried the tone of a man who had everything, except rest. Behind him, his penthouse gleamed with perfection. Marble floors, steel edges, not a single trace of warmth. Every inch of it proved how far he'd climbed, and how alone he'd become. Down on the street, a limousine waited. Daniel Reed stood beside it, steady and patient. He'd been driving Edward for 3 years, long enough to know silence was safer than conversation. He looked up toward the penthouse lights. He didn't envy the man who lived there, only pitied him. A life that high above others never felt free. When Edward stepped into the car, he didn't greet Daniel. He was already on the phone, barking orders. "Close the deal by noon," he snapped. "If they hesitate, replace them." Daniel drove carefully through the traffic. Edward sighed loudly, tapping his watch. "Do you ever drive faster than a snail?" Daniel's calm voice broke the tension. "Safety first, sir." Edward scoffed. "Safety doesn't make money." He leaned back, muttering, "Some people are just born slow." Daniel said nothing. He'd learned not to feed the fire. A truck cut in front of them without warning. Daniel hit the brakes, smooth, but hard. Edward's coffee spilled across his papers. The car fell silent for one breath. Then Edward's rage erupted. "Are you blind? My time costs more than your life." Daniel's hands gripped the wheel tighter. "I'm sorry, sir," he said softly. Edward turned away, shaking his head. "Pathetic." The rest of the drive was heavy with silence. When they stopped, Edward got out without a glance. "Clean this mess," he said coldly, and walked away. Daniel exhaled slowly, steadying his breath. He reached for the glove box and opened it gently. Inside was a small, worn photograph. A young woman smiled from the picture, holding a science trophy. Emma Reed, his daughter. His reason for every long day and swallowed word. He smiled faintly. "One day, Emma," he whispered, "you'll rise above all this." Outside, horns blared and engines roared, but Daniel stayed still, a quiet man carrying a louder dream. Meanwhile, Edward climbed into his tower of glass. His schedule waited. Calls, meetings, power. He thrived on it. The noise, the control, the illusion of importance. He walked into a boardroom filled with suits. Their laughter was sharp, hollow, and cruel. They mocked the weak, worshipped greed, and called it wisdom. Edward laughed with them, louder than anyone else. But even he felt the emptiness echo afterward. He hid it behind another smirk, another deal. That night, his penthouse glowed in the city's reflection. He poured a drink, loosened his tie, and stared out the window. The skyline blinked like a heartbeat. Distant, untouchable. He saw his reflection staring back. For a moment, he didn't recognize the man looking at him. He whispered quietly, "You're fine." He didn't believe it. A week later came the Hale Foundation Gala. Gold chandeliers, perfect smiles, empty hearts. The kind of night where money pretended to care. Edward entered with confidence, as always. Every handshake, every nod, rehearsed, transactional, meaningless. He loved being the center of every whisper. Then the host took the stage. "Please welcome Dr. Emma Reed." Edward barely looked up, but when she began to speak, her voice drew him in. "I grew up watching families choose between rent and medicine," she said. Her words were calm, but they carried truth. "My work is about change," she continued. "About giving children a chance to live, not just survive. The crowd fell silent. Edward listened, almost despite himself. Something in her tone reached a place he didn't know was still alive. When the applause came, it felt distant. He leaned to a colleague. "Who is she?" "Emma Reed," the man said. "Poor background. No family. Brilliant mind." Edward smirked faintly. "A genius idealist. Cute." After the event, he found her near the exit. "Dr. Reed," he said smoothly, "that was impressive." She smiled politely. "Thank you, Mr. Grant." "You speak like someone who believes in what she says," he said. "I do," she replied softly. "Otherwise, what's the point?" He chuckled. "You'll learn. Idealism fades with age." "Only if you let it," she said, her tone steady. He smiled. "Come to my office tomorrow. Let's talk about your work." Her eyes lit up. "Really?" "I like ambition," he said. "It's useful." She smiled politely. "Then I'll see you tomorrow." And with that, she walked away, confident, untouchable, unforgettable. Edward watched her leave, a strange feeling twisting inside him. He didn't know it yet, but his world had already started to change. The next morning, Edward Grant's tower glistened under the sun like a blade of glass cutting through the sky. He stood in his office, surrounded by wealth, but his reflection still looked tired, powerful yet hollow. His assistant entered quietly. "Dr. Emma Reed is here for her appointment." Edward adjusted his cufflinks and smiled, the kind of smile that came more from habit than warmth. "Send her in," he said calmly. When Emma walked in, she carried herself with quiet strength. Not pride, not fear, just focus. Edward gestured toward the chair. "Sit, Dr. Reed. Let's see if your passion matches your presentation." She smiled faintly, sitting down. "I hope my work speaks louder than my passion, Mr. Grant." He leaned back, amused. "Careful, Dr. Reed. In this world, idealism is a luxury. Purpose fades when bills arrive." Her voice was calm but firm. "That's why I build solutions, not excuses." For the first time, Edward didn't have a comeback. He gestured toward the screen. "Show me what you've got." Emma explained her invention, a low-cost medical device that could monitor children's health in poor communities. Her words flowed like conviction turned into science. But halfway through, Edward interrupted her. "Tell me," he said, "what does your father do?" Her voice didn't waver. "He drives." Edward chuckled softly. "A driver? Well, at least he understands the importance of service." Her eyes didn't flinch. "Yes," she said softly. "He does his job with pride, even when people treat him like he's invisible." The silence that followed was sharp, heavier than glass. Edward cleared his throat, pretending not to notice the sting in her words. When the meeting ended, she stood. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Grant." He nodded, his charm forced. "You'll hear from me." As the door closed behind her, Edward exhaled. Something in her tone had unsettled him, and he didn't know why. That evening, Daniel waited by the car as usual. Edward stepped inside, distracted, his phone lighting up with endless notifications. He spoke without looking up. "A young scientist visited today. Ambitious, idealistic, the kind that thinks kindness changes the world." Daniel smiled faintly in the mirror. "Sounds like a good kind of person." Edward scoffed. "Good doesn't win, Daniel. Strength does." Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. He'd heard enough of the world to know better. But when Edward mentioned her name, Emma Reed, Daniel's hand tightened on the wheel. For a moment, his heart froze. He swallowed the truth and kept driving. "She sounds special," he said quietly. "She's stubborn," Edward replied, "but smart." Daniel said nothing else for the rest of the drive. His silence carried more weight than words ever could. That night, Emma called her father. He liked the idea, she said softly. But he doesn't believe people change. Daniel's voice was calm. Then prove they can. The next morning, Edward couldn't focus on his work. Emma's words echoed in his mind. He does his job with pride, even when people treat him like he's invisible. He stared at the city and felt something he hadn't in years. Guilt. A feeling that crept in quietly, like a shadow behind success. He opened his drawer, pulling out an old photo of his younger self, a man who once believed in dreams before power devoured them. He whispered, "What happened to you?" Later that day, curiosity got the best of him. "Find out everything about Emma Reed," he told his assistant. An hour later, a folder arrived on his desk. He opened it casually and froze. There it was, a photograph. Emma Reed, standing beside Daniel, his driver. The world seemed to stop. He stared at the image, the two faces side by side, one filled with innocence, the other with quiet strength. His breath caught. He whispered, "No, it can't be." He flipped the page again, reading the notes, the names. Everything matched. His stomach sank as realization struck. The man he insulted, belittled, and mocked was the father of the woman he respected. He stood up abruptly, pacing the room. "I insulted her father." The words hit him harder than any deal he'd ever lost. That evening, Daniel arrived to pick him up. Edward stepped into the car, but for once the silence wasn't power. It was shame. Halfway through the drive, Edward said quietly, "Daniel, your daughter's name is Emma, isn't it?" Daniel's eyes flickered to the mirror. "Yes, sir." Edward swallowed hard. "She came to see me this week." Daniel nodded. "I know." Edward looked down. "You never told me?" Daniel's voice was steady. "You never asked." The car rolled on, heavy with everything that had never been said. Edward finally spoke, his voice breaking slightly. "Daniel, I've been a fool." Daniel kept his eyes on the road. "You're not the first rich man to forget the people who carry him, sir." Edward exhaled. "I don't want to be that man anymore." For the first time in years, Edward Grant fell silent. Not out of arrogance, but out of respect. The rest of the ride passed without a single word. But in the quiet, two men began to see each other for the first time. When they reached the tower, Edward paused before stepping out. "Daniel," he said softly. "Thank you." Daniel turned slightly, surprised. "For what, sir?" "For showing me what dignity looks like." Daniel nodded once, humbly. "Good night, Mr. Grant." And for the first time, Edward replied, "Good night, Daniel." As the car pulled away, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold, and Edward Grant sat alone, a man finally beginning to understand what truly mattered. The morning light crept gently into Edward Grant's penthouse. He sat by the window, suit jacket folded, untouched. For the first time, his reflection looked unfamiliar, tired, heavy, human. He whispered quietly, "You've built everything, and learned nothing." The words hung in the air like confession. No phone, no meetings, just silence. Downstairs, Daniel waited beside the car as always. But this morning, Edward walked slower, thoughtful. He opened the door himself and said softly, "Come upstairs with me today." Daniel blinked. "Sir?" Edward nodded. "Please." It was the first time he'd ever said that word to him. Inside the office, the world of glass and marble felt different. Edward gestured to a chair. "Sit." Daniel hesitated, unsure. "It's all right," Edward said gently. "I owe you this conversation." Daniel sat slowly, his posture straight but humble. Neither spoke for a moment. The silence felt sacred. Edward broke it with a whisper. "I know who your daughter is." Daniel's eyes didn't move, but his breath caught slightly. Edward continued. "And I know what I've done." He turned away, ashamed. "I've said things to you that no man should say to another." His voice wavered. "And the worst part, I never even saw you." Daniel stayed quiet, his calm steady as ever. He didn't need to humiliate Edward. The truth was enough. Edward took a deep breath. "You've driven me for years, Daniel. You carried me through storms and schedules, and I never once asked how you were." He looked up, eyes damp. "You taught your daughter humility, and I taught mine greed." Daniel finally spoke. "You can still teach her something better." Edward nodded slowly. "Then help me try." And for the first time, Daniel smiled, faintly, but real. That afternoon, Edward stood before his board of directors. The men looked up from their tablets expecting another order. But his voice was different. "Gentlemen," he began, "we've built a company that's powerful, yes, but soulless." A murmur filled the room. Edward raised a hand. "That changes today." One man laughed nervously. "Sir, we're in the business of profit." Edward met his gaze calmly. "Not anymore. We're in the business of purpose." The room fell silent. Edward continued. "We're creating a foundation, hospitals, clinics, affordable care, because no child should die because their parents can't afford help." His assistant whispered, "That will cost millions." Edward nodded. "Then we'll spend it." And for once, no one dared to argue. That night, he didn't go home to his penthouse. He drove himself through quiet streets, searching for something he didn't yet understand. He stopped outside a small clinic on the city's edge. The sign was fading, the windows cracked. Inside, families waited for hours, desperate and unseen. Edward stood at the door, watching in silence. A mother held her child close, whispering lullabies through exhaustion. A nurse hurried between rooms, hands trembling from fatigue. He felt his chest tighten. For the first time, empathy burned deeper than shame. He approached the counter quietly. "Can I help?" The nurse looked up, surprised. "We're full tonight, sir." Edward smiled faintly. "Then take this." He placed an envelope on the desk and left before she could open it. Inside was a check that would keep the clinic alive for years. Outside, rain began to fall, slow, steady, almost kind. Edward stood in it, letting the water soak through his expensive coat. He whispered, "Maybe this is what cleansing feels like." The next morning, Emma arrived at her lab to find new equipment waiting. Her assistant handed her a note, unsigned. For those who never stop believing, Emma smiled softly. "He's learning." Her eyes glistened, proud not for the gift, but for the change. Meanwhile, Daniel drove in silence, but the tension was gone. Edward watched the city pass and said quietly, "Do you ever regret staying quiet all these years?" Daniel smiled in the mirror. "No, silence taught me patience. Patience taught me peace." Edward nodded. "Maybe I'm just learning that now." Daniel chuckled softly. "It's never too late to listen." That night, Edward visited his company's construction site. Workers looked up, shocked to see him there in the rain. He rolled up his sleeves and helped move crates. One of them whispered, "Is that really Mr. Grant?" Another nodded. "Guess even rich men get tired of sitting." For the first time, Edward wasn't commanding. He was contributing, and it felt right. When the sun began to rise, he stood on the half-built rooftop, covered in dust and rain. He looked out at the skyline and whispered, "You've lived for power long enough. Now live for people." The wind carried his words away, and for the first time, they sounded like truth. Days turned into weeks, and whispers began spreading across the city. Something about Edward Grant had changed, quietly, but completely. He no longer barked orders when he entered a room. He listened first. He spoke with calm, not control. People in his company didn't understand it at first. The man who once demanded perfection now asked how their families were doing, and when he smiled, it didn't feel rehearsed anymore. Daniel noticed it most of all. The arrogance in Edward's tone had softened, and in its place grew something fragile and rare: humility. One morning, Edward walked into the office early. He stood before the empty desks, sunlight spilling through the blinds. He whispered, "This place was never about me. It was about them." He left a note on every desk. "Thank you for carrying what I never noticed." The employees found them hours later, and for the first time, believed their boss saw them. Later that day, Edward visited the construction site of the new foundation hospital. Workers stopped when they saw him step onto the dirt. He wasn't in a suit, just jeans and a simple shirt. He rolled up his sleeves and helped lift a beam, sweat on his forehead, mud on his hands, the billionaire who once never touched anything but glass. One worker muttered, "Is that really Mr. Grant?" Another whispered back, "Guess even rich men can change." Edward smiled as he heard them, a quiet pride blooming inside him. Not the pride of success, the pride of purpose. That evening, Daniel drove him home. For once, Edward asked, "Do you have somewhere to be?" Daniel smiled in the mirror. "Home, sir, but I don't mind the drive." Edward nodded. "You've driven me for years, Daniel. Maybe one day I'll drive you somewhere for a change." Daniel chuckled softly. "That'll be the day, sir." Edward smiled, the corners of his eyes softening. The sound of laughter between them was small, but it meant everything. At the company, Edward's transformation continued. He started visiting every department personally. No cameras, no speeches, just presence. He listened to janitors, secretaries, interns, people he once walked past like furniture. Every conversation carved away a piece of the old Edward. One afternoon, he walked into the employee cafeteria. The room froze. He smiled gently. "Mind if I join you?" They nodded nervously. He sat down with his tray, eating the same food, talking about their kids, their dreams. By the end of lunch, the fear in their eyes had turned into respect. That night, Edward stood on the balcony of his penthouse again. The city looked the same, but he didn't. He whispered, maybe the view was never the point. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't in years. "Emma," he said when she answered, "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" she asked softly. "For not giving up on your belief that people can change." Her voice smiled through the phone. "Then keep proving it." "I will," he said. Every day. Over the next months, Edward poured his time and fortune into Emma's foundation. But more than money, he gave something rarer. Himself, his effort, his attention, his presence. He worked quietly behind the scenes, arranging partnerships, reaching out to companies that once only cared about profit. He convinced them that saving lives was worth more than saving margins. Some agreed, some didn't. But for the first time, Edward didn't care who mocked him. Daniel watched with pride. He often said nothing, but his smile said it all. The man he once served now served others. At home, Edward kept a photo of Emma and Daniel on his desk. He looked at it every morning before starting his day. It reminded him why he changed and what it cost to learn. One rainy evening, Edward visited the clinic he had once helped anonymously. The waiting room was brighter now, cleaner, calmer. A nurse recognized him and smiled. "You came back?" He nodded. "Just wanted to see how things were going." She gestured to the full shelves, the new machines. All this because someone cared. Edward smiled faintly. Then it was worth every cent. As he left, a little girl in a hospital gown waved at him. He waved back, tears catching in his throat. The next day, he called Emma again. "Your clinic's thriving," he said. She laughed softly. "Our clinic, Mr. Grant. You're part of this now." He smiled. "I'm honored, Dr. Reed." She replied warmly. "You earned it." As the months went on, Edward's new foundation expanded across the country. Hospitals were built in cities that had long been forgotten, and behind every brick, every wall, was a story of redemption. People began to speak of Edward Grant differently, not as a tycoon, but as a man reborn. And for once, he didn't run from that title. He embraced it. One morning he looked in the mirror again, but this time he didn't see emptiness. He saw peace, and a man finally proud of the reflection staring back. He whispered, "You built something that finally matters." And the echo didn't sound lonely anymore. The months that followed were quiet, but full of purpose. Edward Grant was no longer a name whispered in fear. He was one spoken with gratitude. Every morning, he arrived early, greeting people by name. He asked about their families, their dreams, their struggles. And he listened, really listened. His employees saw it first. The once cold office began to feel alive. Smiles replaced silence. Hope replaced fear. Daniel still drove him every day, but their rides were different now. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they just shared a comfortable silence, the kind born from understanding. One morning, Edward leaned forward and said, "You know, Daniel, you've been driving me for years, but all this time you were really leading me." Daniel chuckled. "I don't know about that, sir." Edward smiled. "Oh, I do. You taught me patience and grace." That afternoon, Edward visited the Reed Foundation Hospital for the first time since it opened. The building shone like a beacon, full of laughter, healing, and life. He walked slowly through the corridors, watching nurses and children, the walls painted with color, the air humming with purpose. A nurse approached, smiling warmly. "Mr. Grant, thank you for what you've done." Edward shook his head gently. "Don't thank me. Thank the people who never stopped caring." When he reached the children's ward, a little boy waved at him. Edward crouched down beside his bed. "How are you feeling, champ?" The boy grinned. "Better. The doctors here are superheroes." Edward smiled through misty eyes. "You're the real hero, kid." He stood up slowly, his heart heavier and lighter all at once. Outside, he found Emma speaking to a group of volunteers. She looked radiant, confident, passionate, unstoppable. When she saw him, she smiled softly. "You came back?" He nodded. "I had to see what hope looks like." She laughed quietly. "You helped build it." He paused, shaking his head. "No, I just made room for it." They stood side by side, watching the hospital entrance buzz with life. Emma turned to him. "Do you ever miss who you were?" Edward thought for a long moment. "No," he said. "That man was rich in everything but meaning." Daniel walked up then, wiping his hands after helping unload boxes of supplies. "Sir," he said, "I never thought I'd see the day you worked harder than me." Edward smiled. "Careful, Daniel. I'm catching up." The three of them laughed, a sound that felt like sunlight. Later, Emma took the stage to thank donors and partners. Edward stood in the crowd, quietly, his hands clasped. When she spoke his name, he lowered his head, humbled. "This hospital," she said, "exists because people can change, and because even those who've lost their way can find it again." The audience erupted in applause, but Edward didn't move. He simply smiled, a quiet smile of peace and pride. After the event, Daniel found him standing alone near the window. "Feels different, doesn't it?" he asked. Edward nodded. "It feels right." He looked out at the skyline, the same city he once ruled through power, now shining with the reflection of kindness he'd helped create. He turned to Daniel. "You once told me respect can't be bought. You were right. But I finally earned it, starting with yours." Daniel smiled softly. "You earned more than that, sir. You earned forgiveness." Edward blinked, emotion catching his breath. "Thank you." That evening, the three of them, Edward, Daniel and Emma, stood outside the hospital entrance as the sun dipped below the horizon. Children's laughter echoed from inside. The air was warm, alive, full of something Edward had never known before. Peace. Emma looked at him. "You did good, Mr. Grant." He shook his head. "No, Emma. We did good." Daniel chuckled. "That's a rare we coming from you." Edward laughed softly. "Get used to it, old friend." They watched the lights of the hospital glow brighter as night fell. And for the first time, Edward didn't feel the need to be anywhere else. As they said their goodbyes, Emma hugged him gently. "Thank you for believing again," she whispered. He smiled. "Thank you for reminding me how." When he walked toward the car, Daniel followed beside him, step for step. The power dynamic that once defined them was gone. Now, they walked as equals. Before getting in, Edward stopped and looked at the city one last time. He whispered to himself, "You don't need to build towers to touch the sky. You just need to lift others high enough to see it." Daniel started the car, glancing at him in the mirror. "Going home, sir?" Edward smiled softly. Finally. As they drove off, rain began to fall, light, steady, forgiving. It danced across the windshield like applause from heaven. Edward looked out the window at the world passing by. The noise, the lights, the movement. It all looked different now. For once he didn't see chaos. He saw life. He whispered, "Maybe being human was the real fortune all along." Daniel smiled. "You found it, sir." Edward smiled back. "No, Daniel. I earned it." The camera pulls back, the car driving through the glowing streets, past the hospital, the laughter, the city lights. And somewhere in that endless night, the man who once thought he owned the world finally belonged to it.